So the first question that I really want to ask you is, what is this project?
Well, if I was to talk about one project in particular that I'm working on or working through at the moment, it would be requeering spaces. So it's based on the kind of reimagining of queer spaces in Brighton. So we're looking at a kind of watershed moment in British history and kind of gay and the gay liberation movement around the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, where it decriminalised kind of some acts, I suppose, but in a way that defined public and private spaces in a different way. So what we were interested in kind of looking at is how that legislation impacted on individuals and how that impacted on, say, a community as well. So how a legislation impacted the ways in which people used social spaces, impacted the way people used their own domestic spaces, and how over the course of maybe 2 or 3 decades that spaces in Brighton changed and how they were reimagined, and kind of looking at how again legislation around Section 28, how that impacted the use of space and the imagining of space as well.
Can you say a little bit about what were the spaces before 1967
Well,
in Brighton?
yeah, I mean that this is the kind of the interesting thing about kind of if we talk about gay spaces or queer spaces, is that perhaps they're underground because of that legislation. So that it's not overt, it's not explicit. And another project that I'm working on is talking to students who were in Sussex in the 60s and 70s and talking about that idea of community. And many say it didn't exist in that time because of, legislation that created an environment where you had to be underground or you couldn't be out, as it were. And you see across time then it's that kind of outness, I suppose, and how the political and kind of social activist ramification of that type of legislation leads to new spaces being opened up. So new social spaces or places where people convene to kind of politicise or kind of to act together. So previous to that, it might have been, it's difficult to say. And there has been a lot of work around Brighton, pinpointing various places of importance for the gay community, I suppose. So Oscar Wilde stayed in Brighton, or Virginia Woolf, I think, is another one. So there's a lot of work around kind of where maybe people had stayed or where they'd worked for a few months. But that kind of idea of a public space, a forum, possibly is not as obvious.
But in the 50s and 60s, what were these spaces in terms of, entertainment, in terms of where people met? What were the nature of these spaces? How did they meet? What were they?
Well, I mean, that's part of the project, is to kind of see, can we do a comparison between before and after, and is there something to be said about that? I mean, one of the examples maybe in London is at the Gateway Club, which was a kind of a social club for women, and that was more kind of theatre, but again a kind of social space, but that had that kind of theatrical aspect to it, so it kind of had a dual purpose, I suppose.
And one of the things I really want to ask you is, how are you going to explore this through a digital map? How are you going to actually try and map these? I mean, firstly, it'd be great if I had a clear idea about what these spaces were.
So we're talking about buildings, we could be talking about a whole building, we could be talking about a room in a building, we could be talking about, there was some great work done around the kind of use of public toilets in Brighton as well, and there was demonstrations around that, I think it was in the 80s. So physical spaces, and reimagining those, because some of them don't exist now. Some of them are maybe buildings that have been repurposed for other commercial endeavours, or maybe they're homes. Others are still seen as queer spaces. The likes of the Marlborough has, I suppose, a history of being a space where queer identified, whether that's LGBTQ plus individuals, could go. And at one point that was a space for women. At one point that was a kind of there was, I suppose, a hotel, and it had rooms for men. So across that time and space that has changed. So what we want to kind of look at and tap into is where those presences are, but also where those absences are. So how do we fill that kind of, if we don't have architectural drawings for something, if we don't have specific things to help reconstruct. How do you, in a map or in a data visualization or in some sort of, exhibit or curated space, how do you account for those absences? And for me, often it's those absences that are important, because we know the Marlborough has a history, but what other spaces were there that don't exist now and aren't explicitly, I suppose, identified? How do we find them, and how then do we represent them through mapping? Or often the maps that we use now, of course, we have the problem, or the kind of challenge of layering historical maps and identifying places that are listed as X street, but now that street doesn't exist anymore. And how do we overcome some of those things?
And what is the role of music in this story, and kind of nightclubs and nightlife? And how are you mapping that?
So, I mean, an awful lot of the kind of the key buildings, so there was 5 key buildings that we identified as a kind of starting point. They're all pubs, taverns, places that, had dances, or places that became nightclubs. So that's key to that. In terms of music, what I find difficult, or there's a tension maybe within maybe if we talk about the music within a community, in terms of maybe LGBT or queer communities, there's people who identify differently within their music, within their genres, and what they identify with. So I think this is kind of mainstream assumption that if you're gay, you're like kind of chart music type thing. But maybe that's a bit too. But what I mean to say is that music music is an identifier. So if people use their sexual orientation as an identifier, as a political identifier, and how you dress and how you present yourself, how you perform, music of course is crucial to that. And sometimes within the gay scene, and I'm using that term liberally, or quite, I'm not saying specifically gay men or gay women, I'm just kind of using that because there is a tension around terms at the moment, I suppose. I think music within that is hugely important, and hugely often not talked about enough. How people identify with their music in that community.
In what ways did they use music to identify themselves?
Well, I suppose just with the social spaces, But again, so trying to reconstruct something like that is difficult. We don't have Spotify playlists. We don't have, necessarily the artifacts to reconstruct that. But that's the type of thing that I'm interested in. And particularly from a personal point of view, because of the type of music that I am interested in, and I suppose where I see myself fit into a certain community.